still remember the moment Daniel asked, "What jewelry?" His voice was casual, almost amused, but my heart didn't skip a beat. I had already moved everything into a safe deposit box. Weeks before, I started noticing small cracks, missing invoices, hushed calls, Linda's sudden interest in my necklace. They thought I was the perfect, oblivious wife. But behind every smile, I was documenting, saving, preparing. The moment he looked at me that morning, pretending nothing had changed, I knew the game had shifted, and I wasn't the same woman they thought they could betray. The champagne in my hand sparkled under the crystal lights of the Whitmore Estate ballroom. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked exactly as the society pages would describe Daniel's perfect wife, in a navy silk gown that skimmed my frame, my hair swept into a timeless chignon. Cameras flashed as people whispered my name in admiration. This was the life everyone envied. At least, that was the illusion. I had perfected the art of smiling without feeling. Tonight was just another evening of it. As Daniel raised a glass with his colleagues, I stood beside him, listening to stories I had heard a dozen times before. It wasn't until I felt the subtle weight missing from my collarbone that something shifted. My hand brushed the bare skin where my sapphire necklace should have rested. That necklace had been a wedding gift, one he told me was irreplaceable. Now it was gone. I turned slightly toward Daniel. "My necklace," I began, my voice even. He glanced at me briefly, his smile unwavering for the crowd. "What about it?" "It's not there," I said, trying to sound as though I were commenting on the weather. Daniel chuckled softly, his hand brushing mine as if to soothe a trivial concern. "You probably left it somewhere. You can be forgetful sometimes." Forgetful. The word sank deeper than I expected. It wasn't just the necklace. It was the way he dismissed me so effortlessly in public, as though my concern was irrelevant. I held my glass tighter and smiled again, but inside, unease began to seep in. For the rest of the night, I noticed things I had trained myself to ignore. Daniel's attention seemed drawn across the room toward Linda, his sister-in-law, who was laughing a little too hard at something he had said earlier. The two of them exchanged glances that were too quick, too knowing. I told myself it was just family, until Linda's eyes flicked toward me with something sharper than amusement. The party ended late, as always. Guests spilled out in clusters of expensive perfume and champagne laughter. Daniel left to handle something at the office, while I returned to the house alone. In the quiet, the walls felt different. The next few days, I began to pay closer attention. It was subtle at first. Bank notifications on my phone showed withdrawals I didn't remember agreeing to. Transfers labeled as business-related had round numbers that made no sense. I asked Daniel once over breakfast where the money was going. "Just investments," he said, slicing into his toast. "Don't worry about it." I didn't press, but I started keeping a private record of everything I noticed. That same week, I began seeing Linda more often. She seemed to have a reason for every visit, dropping off documents for Daniel, bringing wine for dinner, always friendly, always polished. Yet every conversation was layered with faint remarks that lingered long after she left. "That sapphire necklace of yours, you really should keep better track of things," she said one afternoon, her smile too perfect. Or another time as she glanced at the framed photo from my wedding. "Such a beautiful day. I hope it's still just as perfect now." These weren't comments, they were tests. Then, late one night as I walked past Daniel's study, I heard his voice. He was on the phone, his tone low but steady. "She doesn't suspect anything," he said. "We just need to wait for the right moment." I froze, every muscle taut. The words were casual, almost bored, but their meaning was sharp. The she could have been anyone, but my gut told me exactly who. I stepped back into the shadows before he could notice me. For the first time in years, I realized that the perfect life I had been living might not just be fragile. It might already be a fabrication. And beneath the surface, cracks were spreading faster than I could see. The first time I opened Daniel's study when he wasn't home, I told myself it was just to water the plants. That was my excuse, though I knew it wasn't the truth. My eyes skimmed over the shelves, the perfectly aligned books, the polished desk that seemed more for show than for work. Then I saw the small brass key, half hidden beneath a leather notebook. The key led to the bottom drawer. The bottom drawer led to the safe. Inside the safe, tucked between tax documents and insurance papers, was a black ledger bound in soft leather. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. The pages were filled with neat columns of transactions, dates, amounts, transfers. My name appeared in fewer and fewer entries as the months went on. Assets that had once been jointly held were now attached to Daniel alone, or to entities I didn't recognize. And then there was the name. One entry stood out among the numbers: Blue Harrow Holdings, registered offshore. Next to it was the signature of someone I had never heard of. I didn't confront Daniel, not yet. Instead, I photographed every page methodically until my phone was heavy with proof. The next day, I moved the photos and a backup copy of the ledger to a safe deposit box at a bank Daniel didn't know existed. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It was strategy. Days passed, each one feeling like a move on a chessboard. Linda's visits continued. Her comments were growing bolder, though she seemed to underestimate me entirely. "You should be careful with Daniel's schedule," she said one afternoon, pretending to admire the flowers on my table. "He's been distracted lately. I'd hate for you to feel blindsided." Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was calculation behind her eyes. I smiled politely, the way I always did, even as my mind turned over her words. That night, I made a decision. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a lawyer named Carter Hayes. He was quiet, discreet, and he had once gone head-to-head with Daniel and Linda in a high-profile corporate dispute. He had lost, but he remembered every detail of their tactics. When I met him in a dimly lit cafe, I could tell he was surprised to see me. "I didn't expect you," Carter said, lowering his voice. "I thought you were content." "Appearances," I replied. "I need someone who knows how they operate, someone who understands what's at stake." His eyes narrowed, studying me for a moment before he nodded. "If you're serious, we do this my way, quietly. No sudden moves until the timing is right." We shook hands, and in that moment, an unspoken alliance formed. The more I watched, the more the cracks in their carefully built facade began to show. Linda was more impatient now, interrupting Daniel in conversations, dismissing his ideas. I overheard her on the phone more than once, her tone clipped and urgent. One evening, as I passed the guest room where she had been staying, I caught a fragment of her words. "No, it's just a matter of time. Once the papers are signed, everything will be in place." Papers. The word stayed with me. That night, after the house fell silent, I checked Daniel's briefcase. Inside, among business reports, I found a manila folder with legal documents, divorce papers. My name was there in neat black print, with settlement terms that would leave me nearly empty-handed. But as I scanned the documents, something caught my eye. A signature block for Linda. She wasn't just a witness. She was a party to a separate agreement tied to the company's shares. It wasn't a joint plan. It was a setup. And from the way the documents were arranged, I could see the truth forming. Only one of them planned to walk away with everything. I slipped the papers back exactly as I had found them, my pulse steady. This wasn't fear. This was confirmation. Daniel and Linda thought I was the silent wife in the background, but I wasn't just watching anymore. I started playing my part with careful precision. My questions about money grew less frequent, my tone softer. I let Daniel believe I was retreating, folding into the comfortable role of the compliant wife. When he slid new documents across the table for me to sign, I didn't flinch. "This just consolidates some accounts," he said, watching me over his coffee. I smiled faintly and signed without hesitation, my hand steady. I knew he expected resistance. The absence of it lowered his guard. What he didn't know was that Carter had reviewed every document beforehand. Nothing he put in front of me would harm me, at least not yet. Linda, on the other hand, was growing restless. She was no longer trying to mask her ambition. I could see her maneuvering around Daniel in board meetings, quietly gathering her own leverage. Every time she undermined him, she gave me more insight into the fractures within their alliance. At a luncheon she organized, she made a show of praising my patience and loyalty. Her voice edged with something else. When she leaned in to whisper, "It won't be long now," I just smiled, my face unreadable. What she didn't realize was that her impatience was working in my favor. She was pushing Daniel into corners he hadn't planned for, and each misstep was another piece of evidence for me. But then the game shifted. One evening, Daniel returned from a trip earlier than expected. He walked into my study with a folder in hand, his expression controlled but sharp. "I think it's time we simplify things," he said, setting the folder on the desk. "This is just a formality." I opened the folder and saw the document. It was a contract, one I hadn't seen before, that directly impacted the jewelry. In the fine print, the ownership would transfer under certain conditions that could be triggered by the divorce proceedings. It was the first time in weeks that I felt my pulse spike. "This seems sudden," I said, my voice calm, though I could feel the ground shifting. "Just a precaution," he replied smoothly. "You trust me, don't you?" I gave him a small nod, buying time. Trust had nothing to do with it. Later that night, I sat alone in my room, the document replaying in my mind. Something about it didn't match his usual strategy. This wasn't just Daniel's move. I began tracing the connections, the signatures, the subtle changes in legal language. And then I saw it. A detail in the witness section. The signature belonged to Margaret. Daniel had brought his mother into the game. Margaret had always played the part of the warm, dignified matriarch, but her influence over Daniel was undeniable. Now she was quietly reinforcing his position, creating layers of protection I hadn't accounted for. The next few days confirmed it. Margaret began calling more often, showing up to check on the family. Linda grew wary, her conversations with Daniel becoming curt. The dynamic had shifted. Now Daniel and Margaret were aligned, and Linda was on the outside. Their unity, however, came at a cost. Linda began to suspect she might be cut out of the final deal. Her words toward Daniel sharpened, her loyalty cracking. I could see her resentment growing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she made a move. While their alliances splintered, I focused on the contract. One evening, in the quiet of Carter's office, we spread the pages across his desk. "There's a flaw here," Carter said, pointing to a section buried deep in the terms. "A procedural gap. It could invalidate the transfer of the jewelry's ownership, if challenged correctly." The flaw was small, but it was real. The catch? Pursuing it would expose other parts of my plan, potentially sacrificing leverage I had built over months. I stared at the document, my mind weighing the risk. The jewelry had always been more than its monetary value. It was the symbol of everything Daniel thought he controlled, and I wasn't ready to let it go. The courtroom was colder than I expected, its air thick with formality and veiled hostility. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, my demeanor composed. It wasn't time for fireworks. It was time for careful, deliberate moves. Carter stood, producing a set of documents, not the full arsenal, just enough to make them squirm. He introduced the financial records showing transfers from joint accounts into entities under Daniel's control, some even appearing under Linda's name. The shift was immediate. Daniel glanced sharply toward Linda, his jaw tightening. Linda leaned back in her chair, expression deceptively calm, but her eyes flicked toward me with the faintest trace of unease. Every word spoken was calculated. Every piece of evidence was a thread pulled just enough to unravel trust between them. Outside the courtroom, the tension spilled over. Linda approached me in the corridor, her voice low and controlled. "You're not as naive as they thought," she said, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Daniel's been cutting me out. We might have overlapping interests." Her offer wasn't unexpected, but the timing was perfect. Aligning with Linda, even temporarily, would destabilize Daniel further. "I don't make deals lightly," I replied. "If you have something worth my time, prove it." 2 days later, a sealed envelope arrived at Carter's office. Inside were copies of internal company documents, proof that Daniel had shifted assets in a way that violated his own corporate agreements. Tucked among them was a transfer statement confirming the jewelry's ownership status, one that could be contested in court. Linda thought she was securing her place by offering this. In reality, she had just handed me the key to something she couldn't take back. At the next hearing, Carter presented the jewelry ownership records. The procedural flaw we had identified became the foundation of our argument. Piece by piece, the legal framework Daniel had constructed around the jewelry crumbled. The ruling was concise. The jewelry remained my legal property. I allowed myself no visible satisfaction as the decision was read. Instead, I lowered my eyes, appearing as though the weight of it all had left me tired rather than triumphant. Daniel looked at me for the first time with something other than irritation or confidence. It was calculation, and maybe the faintest edge of concern. Back at home, the atmosphere was shifting rapidly. Linda, sensing the walls closing in on her as well, withdrew from her frequent visits. Daniel spent long hours in his study, calls muffled behind closed doors. I stayed quiet, appearing content to keep to my corner of the house. But beneath that calm surface, I was watching every move. When the collapse began, it happened faster than anyone expected. The first blow came from regulators, a formal investigation into the company's financial practices. Carter's carefully timed leaks to the right channels ensured the scrutiny landed squarely on Daniel. The second blow followed within days. Evidence surfaced tying offshore accounts, those under Blue Harrow Holdings, directly to Margaret. The elegant, untouchable matriarch was suddenly a name on investigative reports. The Whitmore family's reputation began to fracture in the public eye. News outlets circled like hawks, each headline cutting deeper. Daniel's calls became more frequent, though never to me. He was too proud to ask for help directly. But one evening, he showed up at the house unannounced, his expression sharp but edged with something almost desperate. "Sarah," he began, standing in the doorway of my sitting room, "we need to talk." I set my book aside. "About what?" He stepped in, closing the door behind him. "Things are complicated. The investigations, the media. This isn't good for anyone." I kept my tone neutral. "And you think I can fix that?" He hesitated, then drew a breath. "I can make all of this go away, but I need your cooperation. A mutual silence." "A mutual silence," I repeated slowly. "And what exactly do I get in return?" Daniel's eyes met mine, steady. "The truth. About Margaret. About why all of this started." I studied him, my mind already running through the possibilities. This wasn't a man making a generous offer. This was a man cornered, willing to trade a dangerous piece of information to save himself. But what he didn't realize was that I wasn't desperate for his truth. I already had my own version and the means to use it. Still, sometimes letting an opponent think they're holding leverage is the best way to make them drop their guard entirely. The verdict was read in my favor. The jewelry and a significant portion of the marital assets legally mine. Carter shook my hand outside the courthouse, reporters swarming like a tide we couldn't stop. I smiled for the cameras, but it was the kind of smile meant to end questions, not invite them. To the public, I was no longer the polished society wife. I was the woman who had beaten the Whitmore family in court, and they had a name for women like me. Within days, headlines screamed, "The revenge wife," "Betrayal or brilliance," "The woman who brought a dynasty to its knees." The scrutiny came fast. Photographers lingered outside my home, every outing dissected online. Invitations to galas and luncheons began to dwindle. Friends who had once smiled at me across dinner tables now sent polite messages about space and privacy. Carter warned me it was inevitable. "You won in court, Sarah, but public opinion isn't a courtroom. People like a villain just as much as they like a hero, and sometimes they prefer the villain. I nodded, though part of me felt the weight of the isolation creeping in. It was on a quiet Wednesday morning that the next blow came. I was sipping coffee, half listening to the news in the background, when a headline cut through the noise. Whitmore victory under fire. Offshore investments raise questions. My name appeared in the subheading. The article claimed I had connections to an offshore investment fund linked to the same jurisdiction as Blue Harrow Holdings. The story hinted at impropriety, suggesting I had used the very same tactics I accused Daniel of employing. It wasn't just speculation, it was surgical. I called Carter immediately. "Where did this come from?" He sighed. "It's deliberate. Someone's feeding the media, trying to drag you back into the mess. We need to identify the source before they gain traction." His tone was calm, but I heard the undercurrent of urgency. We didn't have to wait long for the next piece of the puzzle. An investigative journalist reached out to me off the record. He had information that the offshore fund in question wasn't just a coincidence. It had been managed by a corporate entity tied to a man named Victor Hale. Victor Hale. The name landed like a stone in my chest. Years ago, Victor had been a business associate of Daniel's, one I had strongly advised against working with. Victor had approached me directly at one point, proposing a side venture. I had refused, knowing his reputation for ruthless takeovers. Apparently, he hadn't forgotten. The journalist's notes painted the picture clearly. Victor was quietly feeding stories to the media, using his network to suggest that I was as manipulative as the Whitmores. His aim was clear: damage my credibility, weaken my position, and perhaps lure me into a defensive posture that he could exploit. Carter leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "He's framing you as part of the same game you exposed. It's not about proving you guilty. It's about making you look indistinguishable from the people you fought against." The attacks were coordinated. News outlets began running opinion pieces questioning whether I had been playing the long con from the start. Social media amplified every headline. My inbox filled with requests for comment, some demanding answers, others laced with threats. And then the email arrived. It was short, plain text, no signature. "This game isn't over. You know where to find me when you're ready to play again." Attached was a scanned image of the safe deposit box key, the same kind I had used to secure my jewelry. The message was clear. Victor wasn't just attacking from a distance. He was inviting me into another round. I stared at the email for a long moment before closing my laptop. If Victor thought I would play his game, he was wrong. But if he thought I would walk away without a plan, he didn't know me at all. I could have answered Victor. I could have stepped right back into the arena, armed with Carter's counsel, my evidence, and my reputation as the woman who brought the Whitmore empire to its knees. But I didn't. For the first time in years, I recognized the toll the fight had taken. Every victory had come with a cost. Friends lost, trust shattered, and a constant state of vigilance that left no room for peace. I wasn't going to play anyone's game anymore. Not Victor's, not Daniel's. Within a month, I sold off a portion of the assets awarded to me in the divorce. Some saw it as weakness, others as a calculated retreat. But the proceeds didn't vanish into offshore accounts or shell companies. They went into a new entity entirely, one with my name on it, the Whitmore Foundation for Financial Independence. Its mission was simple: to provide legal, financial, and emotional support to women trapped in marriages where financial abuse was invisible but devastating. For every headline that called me the revenge wife, there were hundreds of quiet messages from women thanking me for proving it was possible to win. As for the Whitmores themselves, their downfall was complete. Daniel's company collapsed under the weight of legal investigations and financial ruin. He was no longer the polished CEO, but a man hounded by creditors, his name now shorthand for scandal. Linda's maneuvering bought her nothing. Her alliance with Daniel shattered beyond repair, her access to company funds revoked, her own reputation destroyed in the process. Margaret, the quiet puppeteer, disappeared entirely. One day her name was all over the financial press. The next it was gone, replaced with speculation about her relocation, her hidden wealth, and her future silence. The dynasty that once tried to erase me had erased itself. One evening, just as I was leaving my office, a package arrived. It was small, unmarked, and carried no return address. Inside was a single item, a key. It was identical to the key I had once used to secure my jewelry in a safe deposit box. There was no note, no signature, but I didn't need either. I knew exactly whose move this was. Victor Hale hadn't left the board. For days, I left the key untouched on my desk. It wasn't fear holding me back. It was a choice. I had stepped out of the game. And yet, holding the cool metal in my hand, I could feel the pull of unfinished threads. Months passed. I rebuilt my life, not as a wife, not as someone's opponent, but as myself. I moved into a smaller home by the coast, far from the city's constant whispers. The air was cleaner there, the days quieter. I traded gala dresses for simple linen, boardrooms for community centers. People still recognized me, but now their tone was different. I wasn't the scandal on the front page. I was the founder of a foundation that had quietly helped dozens of women reclaim their lives. My past was never far away, but it no longer defined me. One spring morning, I was sitting in my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table, when the doorbell rang. It was the postman. He handed me a small, flat envelope, thicker than usual. I recognized the handwriting instantly, though I couldn't place it from any one person. Inside was a simple note. The game has changed. So have you. Beneath the note was an address to a bank and another key. I laughed softly, setting the note aside. When I looked up, the postman was still there, leaning casually against the railing. He smiled knowingly. "Would you like to open it now, ma'am?" he asked. I met his eyes, the faintest smile playing on my lips. "I haven't decided yet," I replied. The choice wasn't about the key. It was about whether I wanted to step into another game, or if I'd finally learned that some victories come from walking away. The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of salt water. Somewhere in the distance, the world was still moving, still plotting. For now, I was content to let it move without me.